Well, here we are, and today I want to talk about the onset of the Cold War and all of its uh, full force, and want to discuss the period between 1950 and 1956, period that begins with the breaking of the atomic monopoly that the United States enjoyed between 1945 and 1949, the breaking of that monopoly, and the Suez Crisis. So these are interesting years that don't always get understood properly in all of the accounts that I know about, but I'm going to try to make them a little more clear than I think is normally indicated by these accounts. Let's discuss that today. I hope you're reading along in Fink. Fink is our guide, to many things, and we want to rely on her, profit from her work, and also criticize her as time goes by. So I hope you are reading along in Fink, and I hope you will be comparing her version, her take on the origins of the Cold War, as opposed to the take that you get from the last couple of sessions with me. The origins of the Cold War, according to me, are a little bit different and a little more difficult. And they are to be compared, I think, for the most part, with the stuff that Oliver Stone suggests in the video that I asked you to watch. So I'm hoping you'll be checking these things out. You'll be taking notes and you'll be developing your own ideas about these things. Be prepared to take a position one way or another. Fink is right, Fink is wrong. Oliver Stone is right, Oliver Stone is wrong. D'Agostino is right, D'Agostino is wrong. Please consider the former proposition that D'Agostino might be right about some of this stuff. That's at least a possibility. So at any rate, I hope you will be doing all that. I talk about the origins of the development of the Cold War today, not the origins. Last time we were talking about the origins. You remember the argument I ended up with? I was trying to answer that question that the right-wingers always threw at the Democrats in those days, especially at Harry Truman. They said, who lost China? Who lost China? And the idea that seemed to go along with that idea was, that question was that Truman had lost China. And that soft U.S. policy that did not plunge in and land a lot of troops on the on the Asian continent, did not land a lot of troops in China, did not fight over China, that they were the ones who lost China. Or another version of that was to say that Chiang Kai-shek was really giving the death blow to communism in 1946, and that we did not give him enough support, prevented him from really putting the KO on the communists. Very, in my opinion, very tenuous, very threadbare kind of proposition. But this was a thing that was tossed at Truman in those days, and was tossed at anybody who was not a proper Cold Warrior. Who was tossing it? Mainly the people on the right, most of the Republicans, Taft-style Republicans. They'd been out of office for a long time. They wanted to get after Truman for almost anything they could think of. And not to say that this was not a substantial thing to think of, but that there were other new voices. William Noland, who was to become senator from California, in his newspaper, the Oakland Tribune, they were pounding away on this who lost China question. So it created an enormous controversy, and it made a contribution to McCarthyism, I think, on the whole, to this rabid, pointless, unthinking anti-communism in the United States, and this whole lost China position was very first and foremost in their thinking as they attacked the Democrats. So I'm hoping then that you're thinking about these things and considering it, and considering in that vein the stuff I said about who lost China. Remember, I made the argument that it might be possible to suggest that maybe the Cold War lost China. That we had an opportunity to perhaps avoid the Cold War, at any rate, avoid the Cold War in its worst form, and put it off, perhaps postpone it at least for a while. This is connected in some way with Oliver Stone's ideas, although I think he goes way overboard with this. But on the whole, it's not. This is not an idea that's totally unrelated to some of the things he argues about the possibilities offered by the Henry Wallace presidency. But the argument I've been making is that the United States made the Cold War essentially in Europe, that it shut the Soviets out of a say in the determination of German affairs. It insisted on the expulsion of the communists from the French and Italian governments. It essentially did everything it could to oppose the Soviets and to wreck all possibility for any kind of cooperation with them. That no accident, no surprise, I think, that Soviets stopped cooperating in Asia. So they closed things down, sealed off the bloc, and turned to the support of Mao Zedong in Asia. So they hadn't done that before that. So 1947 becomes an important turning point. The Varga Line was for good relations with the West. And the Varga Line collapses dramatically in 1947. And it's no accident, I think, that Stalin turned at that point to Asia and issued or at any rate, encouraged Mao to issue the slogan for the very first time in the spring of 1947, "Down with Chiang Kai-shek." So that raises the idea that maybe had Roosevelt's line, Henry Wallace's line on Soviet Union being pursued for a while, perhaps Stalin would have cooperated in Asia, and we wouldn't have had a full development of the Civil War in the way that we did. Not to say that it is easy to imagine a cooperation between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communists in China on a long-term basis. That's a tough one. So these are difficult propositions, I admit. And we're not talking about some awful blunder that, had it not been made, everything would be, heaven would be hell and vice versa. I'm not saying that, just saying things might have gone somewhat differently, and we can't say for sure exactly how differently they would have gone. Anyhow, that's the argument I've been making up to then about the origins of the Cold War. And on the who lost China question, my answer becomes the Cold War lost China. Okay, so asking you to consider that and to think about how it will form your ideas in interpreting history from this point on. But today, let's talk about the Cold War between 1950 and 1956. Let's talk about the topics that are included on an outline that should accompany this lecture. And the outline's titled "The Cold War Hardens and is Opposed, 1950 to 1956." I guess we have to start with the terrible shock that came over U.S. opinion when the Soviets tested their nuclear device in 1949. So remember, the United States is on a kind of an emotional and spiritual high in 1948 because of the Berlin blockade. So the United States has answered the Berlin blockade with the airlift to Berlin. And this airlift is very, very popular and, not to say heroic looking, to the Germans and maybe to all the Europeans and maybe to everybody in the world. And certainly to American opinion, makes the United States look marvelous. And it's doing this heroic thing, bringing in food, and in the end, it's going to break the blockade. Well, not so much that airlift, but really the formation of NATO, you might say, breaks the blockade. Or another way of looking at it, maybe Stalin got enough out of the blockade. And simply decided to close it down. Maybe it wasn't forced on him at all. This is up for discussion and debate among historians. Maybe it wasn't forced on him at all. Maybe he got enough out of it. He got China out of it. He got the Chinese Revolution out of it. So that's an interesting proposition we have to consider. Anyway, the shock in the United States is absolutely immense, and it looks absolutely horrible for the Truman administration. It has decided to muscle up against communism in this way that I think it had to lead the American public. I don't think there was a popular outcry for this policy that is indicated by the Truman Doctrine in 1947. So he's really had to lead the American public into this view of communism as just about as bad as fascism. In other words, I mean, we just got through fighting a world war against fascism. Now, presumably, we're supposed to fight a world Cold War against communism. That is an enormous turn of thought if you really stop to consider it. And Truman really was not pressed into that by public opinion. He had to lead public opinion through that. So it's a very difficult proposition for him politically. Now look what's resulted from it. China has become communist. So we're now no longer talking about a Soviet bloc, but we're talking about a Sino-Soviet bloc. You know, two massive countries. If you consider the populations involved, there's a lot of people. An enormous thing geopolitically. And on top of that, it's a Sino-Soviet bloc after 1949 armed with nuclear weapons. So this is an enormous shock. Should we call it an enormous defeat for the Truman administration? I'm not sure if that language would work. Ask yourself whether you would write an essay about this, calling it a defeat. Great victory for communism. That would be looking at it pretty much the way Stalin and Mao Zedong looked at it. That this is an enormous victory for communism. There'd always been a kind of an inkling. I don't want to say it was the major note, but always a kind of inkling in the communist movement as far back as Lenin, to the effect that the communism really would in the end finally win when it won over the big, enormous populations of countries like India and China, and that would really be the turning point for the great victory of world communism. So in a way, that supposition, which I do not think was the majority thought among the people of Lenin's time or even of Stalin's time prior to World War II. But now that thought, people can look back and say, maybe Lenin did have an inkling about this. Maybe it is going to be a question of East versus West, not in Europe, but on a global scale. The global East and the global West, Asia versus the Atlantic. So maybe it's going to be that kind of thing from this point on. So looking at it from their point of view, one would arrive at conclusions like that. But let's go back to the American point of view. The shock that this creates, the enormous challenge that seems to be presented by the Sino-Soviet bloc geopolitically. But then let's look at nuclear weapons in the most specific way, because now we have to face the fact, and Truman and his generation, I don't think, properly faced the fact that their nuclear monopoly would not last forever. And you can see this in some of the writings of the most influential people in the Truman administration. Quite a few of them thought that they'd have at least a generation of a nuclear monopoly. Now the Soviets have got the bomb. What's the impact of that? Or perhaps more specifically, what can the United States do about it? What's to be done? Is there an answer to the tremendous blow that's been dealt to the United States by the Chinese Revolution and the breaking of the U.S. nuclear monopoly? What is the answer to this? What can the United States do in response? Well, what it did in response was to develop a thought that perhaps it ought to go to the building of the super. That's what it was called in those days, the HBomb, the hydrogen bomb, a bomb built on a fusion reaction. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a fission weapon. And now this is a weapon that involves nuclear fission and nuclear fusion as well, to the point that it gives a yield that is exponentially greater than the yield of the bombs that ended World War II. So if we measure their yield in kilotons, that is to say, thousands of tons of TNT, we have to measure the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, theoretically possible, presumably, as scientists like Edward Teller were telling Truman. We have to measure this H-bomb in megatons, millions of tons of yield, millions of tons of TNT. So this gives an indication some of the power of the thing. There was the test at Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific with a number of warships. You can see those warships. They're tiny little things underneath the mushroom cloud, the explosion. So this is a colossal weapon. And just to try to get an idea what this kind of weapon might have done to a city, well, let's take a look at some maps and outlines of the atomic bomb yield as it might affect a strike on Manhattan, on New York City. So the Hiroshima bomb on in the left diagram, with a warhead pretty much like the one that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II, that would pretty much make a terrible mess out of Midtown Manhattan. I mean, according to this map, you know, Greenwich Village might have a chance, and people around Central Park, the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, Harlem, they might have something of a chance. At any rate, they would not be in the middle of the fire zone of that weapon. But look what results if you consider the possibility, God forbid, of course, but if you consider the possibility of an H-bomb hitting Manhattan, it pretty much destroys, I mean, in a very thoroughgoing way, pretty much destroys everything in Manhattan and the Bronx, Queens, and a lot of Jersey as well. So an enormous difference, a colossal difference in yield. Does this bomb make any sense militarily? I mean, if you're going to attack a city, do you really want to do that much damage to a city? Does that have a military mission? That's a question that came before all the people who had to make the decision about it. This question of the super. And people like Robert Oppenheimer, who directed the Manhattan Project, working on the development of the atomic bomb, they opposed this thing. And they said the reason was it didn't have a military mission. Well, it's a pretty good argument. It did not have a military mission. And those who supported the idea of the super, who really wanted to go through with it, they continued to insist that it had to be done, but they had a hard time arguing for precisely what the military mission, I mean, how this thing would actually be used in war, why it's more efficacious than a smaller warhead. They had a hard time making this argument. Finally, the clinching argument that Edward Teller used, that in the end probably won the day, was to say that, well, whatever military mission this thing is appropriate for, the Russians are working on it. So they're going to have it, whatever it is. We don't even know. But at any rate, they're going to have it. So if they're going to have it, we've got to have it. We've got a chance to beat them to it. So let's go. This is actually absolutely correct. We know from the writings of Andrei Sakharov, the Russian opposite number of Oppenheimer, we know that the Soviets went directly from working on the kiloton bomb to the megaton bomb, from working on the old-fashioned bomb to the thermonuclear weapon based on fission and fusion. So we know the Soviets were going to get it first if the United States didn't get it. I don't know. Is that the key argument? Can one say that this argument clinches the matter? Well, it did for them at the time. It did for the Truman administration, and they decided to go ahead with the thermonuclear development, the super bomb. Is that a proper answer, we might ask, to the Chinese Revolution and the breaking of the nuclear monopoly? Are we going to see a certain pattern throughout the Cold War? I'll make reference to it more and more as we go through this thing. The Soviets steal a march on the United States in the realm of revolution and geopolitics. The United States doesn't know what to do about it. And the only thing it can think of is to build some more weapons and threaten the Soviet Union all the more. Threaten communists all the more with nuclear weapons. A very powerful motif in the arms race. I'll be referring to it from time to time. This is the first time it, I think, comes up. I don't think the H-bomb is exactly an answer. Maybe it was inevitable, but I don't think we can say it's exactly an answer, a fully balancing answer in some kind of grand strategic sense to the geopolitical fact of the Chinese Revolution. We're going to see how that's going to change everything in this course. By the way, just to give you a little hint, when I get to the end of the course, I'm going to end up saying that perhaps the Chinese Revolution is the most important thing that happened in this entire Cold War period. So I don't know if the HBomb properly balances that in terms of, I don't know, abstract calculations of balances of forces in the world, balance of power, things of that nature, calculations of realpolitik, all the rest. But at any rate, the strategy of the United States is to deliver this thing via aircraft. Now, they have not fully developed the nuclear revolution, which is going to be finished up by the end of the 60s. The nuclear revolution is the revolution that introduces the thermonuclear warheads, or really warheads of any possible yield, to be delivered by intercontinental ballistic missiles. Let's say to be delivered from thousands and thousands of miles away, to be delivered from the middle of the United States to the middle of the Soviet Union, and vice versa. That's the nuclear revolution of the period. And by the way, it is still with us. This is still the way, for the most part, and of course there have been many embellishments, but for the most part, this is the heart and soul of a nuclear conflict as imagined by the military staffs of both powers, even to our day. But in those days, they didn't have missiles. So the revolution wasn't complete. We'll see it complete by the end of the 50s with the Soviet testing of Sputnik, which indicates the capability that they have an intercontinental ballistic missile. ICBM, we'll be calling it. And this period is a little bit different. We have no missiles yet. So what we've got is B-36s, big bombers, but they're essentially in the family of bombers that did most of the damage in World War II. So essentially they are ringed around the Soviet Union in a series of bases. We've got bases in Britain, Italy, a few other places, Japan, Greenland. We've got bases ringing the Soviet Union, and now it's going to be the Sino-Soviet bloc. And so these bombers would have to be the means of delivering this weapon. The United States, that is, did not go ahead to missiles. All right, now looking ahead a little bit, the Russians did. They went ahead with a missile program. Why didn't that happen in the United States? Why did the Russians get a lead on the United States in missiles, which by 1957 presented the United States with an enormous challenge of Sputnik? And we'll talk about that, talk about the psychological aspects of it and its ramifications on all of world politics. But why didn't the United States go for the ICBM right from the get-go, as might have been done, as was done by the Soviets? And I would answer that question simply by saying that the airmen had enormous prestige in those days. That the airmen had carried out an enormous bombing in Europe and also in Asia. That people could make the argument that air power had really won the war, or at any rate played such an important role in winning the war that from this point on, one would have to think primarily in terms of the superiority of air power in any kind of military calculation. The Air Force didn't belong as an auxiliary of the Army, as it was in World War II. According to the National Security Act of 1947, there's a separate Air Force. So now there's a separate bureaucracy, I guess you could say. You know, I hope I can use the word bureaucracy to describe these armed forces opinions, because it's true that the Air Force and the Navy, they clash on various things. And the Army, they clash with the other two. And there is a bureaucratic elbowing for room in Washington, especially elbowing for budget room with Congress. And the airmen were enormously powerful. They had huge prestige. They're just coming off the Berlin Airlift and everything associated with that. And the bomber people did not think missiles were the way to go, at least for the moment. And they were to argue continuously right up until the Kennedy administration that they still thought it was better to have a human being in control of the delivery of this weapon, and the bomber gave that. The missile did not. And so they always made this argument. As you can see, they represent people who are arguing for a certain technology that's been put in the shade by another technology, and they're trying to save the original technology because it's their bread and butter. And it's a bureaucratic question. And one can understand the arguments made on all sides here. And I would argue that the prestige of the airmen was to such an extent, they were celebrated everywhere in the movies. Jimmy Stewart and June Allison represented a great SAC pilot, Strategic Air Command pilot, and his wife, going through all of the problems that are associated with military families, and doing this essential heroic work. It's not war. I mean, it wasn't a war movie, really. It's a deterrence movie. Deterrence. So their role in deterrence is so enormous. Their prestige is so pronounced that they had that kind of influence over Congress. And I think that is probably the major factor. I would guess, at least put it forward as a hypothesis, that if one had to explain why it is the United States did not throw all of its budgetary resources into missile production, at least to the degree that the Soviets did, that this is the reason for it, that the airmen still had so much influence. Okay, so that's the picture then. And there's one other aspect of this thing that we're not properly appreciated, and that is the development of this enormous anti-communism on a scale that we hadn't seen before, although we've seen inklings of it, but not really on the scale of the anti-communism of Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. So there he is, standing before a map of all the Communist Party headquarters, presumably the Communist Party organization in the United States. What is he talking about here? It's an organization of about probably less than 10,000 members in the United States. These people are hunted, and there's enormous propaganda against them. I don't think you could say they're exactly a popular cause. They certainly haven't got the kind of prestige that they have in France and Italy. They have not played a big role in an American resistance movement, so that's lacking. So I don't know what McCarthy is so agitated about here. In fact, a lot of people thought that way at the time. What is McCarthy so agitated about? He had had a lunch with Father Edmund Walsh, who organized the school for diplomacy, the teaching of diplomats at Georgetown in Washington. And at this lunch, Walsh, according to Richard Revere's biography of McCarthy, Father Walsh suggested to McCarthy. McCarthy said, I don't know where I'm going with my career. I need an issue. I'd like to, do more and be more. Don't exactly know what issue to attach myself to. And Father Walsh said, well, why not communism? Why not communism? That's at any rate the way Richard Revere tells it in this much read biography of Senator McCarthy. Well, for whatever reason, McCarthy started out with a wheeling speech in 1950, announcing that he's going to chase all the communists out of the United States, going to find them one way or another. This is not the beginning of the anti-communist purge in the United States. It really goes back to the promulgation of the Truman Doctrine in 1947 and Truman's purge of Washington Beltway bureaucracies, the State Department and other bureaucracies, and a simultaneous purge that went on in the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the big industrial union organization from the 1930s that conducted a lot of strikes and organized big unions, the auto workers, steel workers, longshore, etc. There was a big purge in the CIO, and a lot of communist dominated, as they called them, unions were driven out in 1947. A lot of big ones, in fact, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. ILWU, a big one here, International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, under the leadership of Harry Bridges, who was accused of being a communist. I guess he was close to being a communist. As a matter of fact, he registered as a Republican, did Harry Bridges. Um, Professor Cherney has written a lot about Harry Bridges and continues to write about him. So I suggest if you're interested in local questions that come out of the general strike, longshore strike and general strike of 1934, and have continued ramifications after World War II with the ILWU, that you consult the work of Professor Cherney. But at any rate, this anti-communist purge starts a lot earlier. It starts in 1947, and it's really McCarthyism. Usually we think of this point of view as McCarthyism. That's what we say today. We say McCarthyism. Someone starts hooting about communists and doesn't know what he's talking about. Usually we say, you know, it sounds like Joe McCarthy or McCarthyism. But it goes back to 1947 or so. So it's kind of well underway. And McCarthy really didn't add very much to it. He certainly added a lot of, noise to the topic, an enormous amount of noise. And he certainly did use it to present threats that a lot of people in Washington, a lot of public servants who worried about the fate of their country, thought were quite dangerous. Eventually came to think were quite dangerous. And as a matter of fact, he never caught any communists. He was always brandishing lists of communists and accusing people of having communists here and communists there in their employ. But he never really actually did anything about it. So it was mostly for show, but it was colossal in its effect. Not with everybody. Here you have an audience that is not exactly thrilled with everything McCarthy is arguing. Joe Welch, who is defending the army against him, this is in 1954, looks a little depressed by this brilliant exposition of the power of the communists. I guess McCarthy is saying they're pretty strong in Arizona and New Mexico, according to his geopolitical map of the Communist Party strength in the United States. And Welch is thinking, holy moly, do I get paid for this or not? So it didn't impress everybody, but it did make a lot of noise, frighten a lot of people. Here's a cartoon by Herblock, who did a lot of them on McCarthy for the Washington Post. So he's a famous liberal, famous liberal cartoonist, and we'll be following a lot of his cartoons as we go through the course. Gives you an indication of the liberal point of view, as represented by the Washington Post for the most part, throughout most of this course. So McCarthy is kind of a grim character, according to Herblock, indicated here. McCarthy is reversing, in effect, everything Roosevelt taught about freedom from fear. He's got everybody afraid of their shadow, afraid of being accused of being a communist, or sounding like a communist, or looking like a communist, or being married to a communist, or something like that. And not very American in its spirit, Herblock thinks. And of course, the people who are carrying out all of the witch hunting, the anti-communist hunting, especially the Committee on Un-American Activities, and of course Joe McCarthy himself. Joe McCarthy was not on the committee for the House Committee for Un-American Activities, HUAC it is sometimes called. But at any rate, all of these anti-communists, they say, well, we've got to break some eggs if we're going to make an omelet. You know, there have got to be some problems. There have got to be some people. And I guess what they're saying is that a lot of innocent people have to be either annoyed or frightened or persecuted in some way in order for us to really get to the communists. If you really took this idea seriously, which I don't know that I've ever met anybody who did take it that seriously, but if you really did, if the communists really were so dangerous, it would almost justify anything to get the communists. So I guess everything hinges on the idea, are they so dangerous? Are they such a threat? I mean, has anybody ever seen the Communist Party, consulted their newspaper, or seen them do anything dangerous to the United States? hard to find people who actually imbibe this notion of their extreme danger, such as represented by McCarthy. And a lot of Republicans were pretty embarrassed about it. Margaret Chase Smith of Maine, she's a Republican. She says of the Republican Party, hey, this is not the game of the Republican Party to be going down the road with Senator McCarthy. And then this cartoon is an indication of that. Here's another Herblock. The president himself a little bit intimidated by McCarthy. Now we know from Sherman Adams' memoirs, Sherman Adams was his closest associate, and many people argued really ran the government for Eisenhower after he came to power in the elections of 1952. Sherman Adams says, I never liked McCarthy and always thought this was nonsense, didn't go for it at all, but was not entirely courageous in standing up against it. And that's what Herblock is saying here, that McCarthy is not a real fighter against McCarthy, not doing enough. And another cartoon on the phenomenon gives an indication that McCarthy is, kind of rummaging around, not sure exactly what his role is going to be. Maybe he really thinks that he can start running Washington, start dictating to presidents, or maybe be the president, or something like that. That there's almost no limit to this man's ambition. And this, I guess, was the main problem. He finally got to persecuting the army and insisting that there were all kinds of communists in the army and important people. People say, well, let's see some names. Who are these communists you're actually talking about? And he ended up with an army dentist by the name of Major Paris. Why, he said, had this dentist been promoted? Gee, a dentist in the army. I guess he was going to be a major danger to the crowns and fillings of military personnel. Something like that. Anyhow, when McCarthy got around to the army, I think there was a general sense among public-spirited folk in the upper reaches of the American elite to the effect that really it had gone far enough, and McCarthy could not be allowed to rummage through the armed forces and start rearranging the chain of command. No, that couldn't be permitted. And so he was taken on by the Senate. And here's a Senate counsel appointed, Joe Welch, who was attacking McCarthy. And in the end, this is what convinced the Senate to vote a censure of McCarthy to tell him to lay off in 1954. And that pretty much ended his career. A lot of people wrote against McCarthy, published against McCarthy, but not with enormous courage. One very courageous voice was I.F. Stone, who published a little rag called I.F. Stone's Weekly. You can probably still get hold of it one way or another. I bet it's on the internet. And you can get a day-to-day, blow-by-blow account of the factual aspects of the things that McCarthy was saying. I.F. Stone was pretty good with facts on the whole. Wrote some interesting books. Not everything he said is exactly something you might believe as a historian. But, he's entitled to speculate about the facts he had uncovered. Generally speaking, a pretty honest journalist on the whole. The McCarthy period and all of anti-communism had a colossal impact, which did not go away when McCarthy went away. So you'll find that rummaging around on Netflix or some other service that you use to look at old movies from the 50s, you're going to find quite a few real outrageous, ridiculous films portraying the communists in a very, how to put it, imaginative way. In an imaginative way. And this one in particular, for example, I married a communist with Robert Ryan and Lorraine Day, people I really like as actors. Oh, and another actor that I think is just terrific, character actor by the name of Thomas Gomez. He actually plays a communist in here, and it's really quite indistinguishable from a big mafia chieftain. So he's ordering people to be shot. He's, acting like the big boss, and etc. Ridiculous. ridiculous stuff. But they were able to get away with this stuff. Remember, I made the argument going way back that there was a certain sentiment at the end of the war, certain sentiment suggesting that a lot of old reactionary things could be protected under the cover of calling their proponents communists or saying that they led to communism, encouraged communism, loved communism or something. Race mixing in the South, that was communism. Opposing Jim Crow, that's communism. Being against states' rights or the Bourbon wing of the Democratic Party, all of the elements of what you would call the Jim Crow aspect of race relations in the United States, that's communist. Well, it's not wrong that the communists tried in all of their propaganda to stick up for black people and to oppose Jim Crow. That's not wrong. But whether it is communism to oppose Jim Crow, gee, that's wrong. That's not right. Often it was made out that almost anything the communists did involved some kind of misleading of the left. So that in that way, all this anti-communist propaganda, although it was always saying that the left or trade unions or people who oppose Jim Crow or whatever ought not to fall for communism, often that became a way of opposing these people, opposing some reasonably arguable propositions, liberal propositions, as leading toward communism, being influenced by the communists, something like that. It had an enormous, it had so much of an influence that I don't think it has dissipated to this day, although we don't even have communism anymore, at least not the way it looks. But even without it, I think there are still remnants of this thinking that really have not dissipated. Okay, so the immediate result of the Chinese Revolution and the breaking of the nuclear monopoly on the United States side is the creation of the super and everything that goes with that. So new nuclear weapons, new nuclear threats to the Sino-Soviet bloc. So this is a diagram, a map I indicated to you from that I gave you last time, talking about the Chinese Revolution and the geographical spread of the Chinese Revolution. You see Korea figures in this thing, and I think we mentioned at that time that North Korea played a big role in helping out the Chinese communists. So it rather makes sense that now that the Chinese Revolution has proved to be successful, that Mao and Stalin are leading communist movement toward a brighter future, they announce in the rest of the world that they might get together and try to expand things and punish the United States for its opposition to communism. So now the Cold War is now turning into a blow for blow, action, reaction responses, and both sides thinking of ways to hurt the other side, that they might hurt them in Korea by encouraging Kim Il-sung on the left in this triptych, Kim Il-sung of Korea, encouraging him to attack the South and absorb Korea. And who knows what might result from that. Maybe the United States will defend it with troops, and the Sino-Soviet bloc will have an opportunity to attrit the United States, to make some American boys, as Mao Zedong liked to think of it, come home in coffins, and to try to impress upon the Americans that they cannot match communism in Asia, cannot match it man for man in combat. Don't know why the American policymakers didn't take this idea more seriously, they would have saved themselves a great deal of agony, which we will be describing in a certain amount of detail. But at any rate, that I think certainly was the attitude of Mao and Stalin. I think they wanted to go after the United States in inaccessible places and force the United States to fight and see if the United States could tolerate losses and inflict punishment by the expansion of the revolution by military means. So this is not the way communism has always thought of expanding the revolution, quite different in Lenin's time. But we don't know whether Lenin would have acted exactly the same way had he had the wherewithal that Stalin and Mao have at their disposal. You know, atomic weapons, defeat of fascism, etc. Whether they had these weapons at their disposal. At any rate, these two step forward as the great leaders of mankind and march into Korea in summer of 1950. So there's a situation in Korea, and you see in the diagram on the left. See if I can get a pointer into the equation here. Oops. Well, pointer or no, let's take a look at North Korea and the attack that it made against South Korea. You see, it's perfectly successful in the summer of 1915. It presses the forces of the why have I lost the pointer? Oops. Oops. That the North Koreans have pressed into South Korea and are now pressing on Pusan. So the Pusan perimeter, this is down in the southeast part of that little perimeter, down in the southeast part of South Korea. That's the only place the South Koreans, or the only territory they're able to hold against these North Korean forces in the summer of 1950. Then the President Truman, declared that he was going to defend South Korea, and General MacArthur landed troops at Incheon, just a port right next to Seoul, the capital, and they outflanked, in effect, all of the North Korean forces in South Korea, and were able to win a terrific victory, liberating Seoul, liberating the capital, liberating South Korea, and pressing over the boundary line, the 38th parallel, into North Korea, pressing upon the North Koreans themselves. So they would have won the war at this point. But you know, there's always the phenomenon of mission creep, that once you win something in hot pursuit, you start to think what else you can win. And so the war aim of the Korean War, instead of defending South Korea and returning it to the status quo before the war, it got transformed, and the war aim that the American policy under President Truman and General MacArthur now became to unite the Koreas, to destroy the communist power against North Korea. So it turned into an offensive against North Korea, and the American forces succeeded in marching all the way up the Korean Peninsula, which they reached by the end of 1950. In the winter of 1950, they were on the Yalu River, which separates North Korea from China. And in a place called the Chosin Reservoir, Mao Zedong made the decision that he was going to send large numbers of Chinese regular forces into the battle. Most of the forces he sent, we now pretty much understand, were Kuomintang forces that came across to him in the course of the Civil War and late in the Civil War. Whole divisions that defected from the Kuomintang and came over to the communists, whom Mao didn't trust really, and was going to send. So Mao, at least according to some authorities, Mao was trying to attrit his own forces by sending them into North Korea. But at any rate, the main thing to inflict attrition on the American forces, which they properly did, drove the United States out of North Korea and all the way back to the 38th parallel. They retook Seoul, but then were driven out of Seoul again. So it went back and forth right at the 48th parallel for a while. And then it settled down while peace talks were finally arranged. But once these peace talks started, the fighting didn't start. It didn't stop. And it's after the peace talks started that some of the worst battles that were fought in the Korean War were waged. Pork Chop Hill, Heartbreak Ridge, ghastly World War I type battles involving all infantry and artillery. Tanks didn't get a chance to provide any mobility to the battlefield. So it's huge losses. You can imagine American forces drafted into this thing, American boys, now going to fight in these ghastly battles, politically a very difficult, nasty thing for the Truman administration, and it really did ruin the Truman administration. I'm convinced. But at any rate, that was the situation in Korea. While it was going on, General MacArthur took the view that he could break the stalemate by attacking Manchuria. So General MacArthur would have been willing to attack the bases of the Chinese in Manchuria, attack China, in other words. And it was even suggested that this attack on China might involve the use of nuclear weapons. That perhaps this would be a good way, a good opportunity to do what hadn't been done in the Chinese Civil War and roll back the Chinese Revolution. Very appealing idea to the right in the United States. Absolutely alarming idea to everybody else, and especially to the British. Clement Attlee, the head of the British government, flew specially to Washington to try to warn him against MacArthur. Do not get involved in bombing Manchuria and bombing China. It's going to be a complete disaster. And Truman had to weigh the thing, and when he added up the pluses and the minuses of the thing, came to the conclusion that he had to drop MacArthur. So he took the very, very stern stance. Nobody can say that Truman was afraid of taking a difficult decision, of getting rid of MacArthur, of forcing MacArthur's dismissal, his resignation. This cartoon gives an indication of how that was presented in the press of much of the country, that this little man, Truman, who had never accomplished much, who had not even won World War II, was not even a hero of World War II, had dismissed the man who led the American forces against the Japanese Empire, and the man who had run Japan as a kind of potentate after World War II. Man of enormous prestige and colossal charisma, as compared to Truman, a very dramatic contrast. And MacArthur returned to the United States after his dismissal, made a speech to a joint session of Congress, which ended with the idea that there used to be a song, he said, at West Point about old soldiers. Never die, they just fade away. So like the old soldier in that song, I am prepared to fade away. An old soldier had tried to do his duty as God gave him the light. And you imagine housewives, after dinner, the radio on, listening to MacArthur deliver this thing to Congress, and of course this huge ovation in Congress. And so it worked very much against Truman's prestige. And, in fact, it looked as if MacArthur might even make a stab at trying to get the nomination for president of the Republican Party and run against Truman. defeat him. Well, he didn't, but somebody else did. General Eisenhower ended up doing so. Might say MacArthur paved the way for him. So the Truman administration, I would argue, maybe you could even say the New Deal went under with the Korean War. General Eisenhower was able to win power by suggesting he had a way to get out of Korea. He would go to Korea. He would figure out a way to get out of it. So it's the election of Dwight Eisenhower is very much a referendum on the Korean War, very unpopular with the United States. Another interesting aspect of this Korean War was, though, that it alerted U.S. officials to the importance of Japan economically, and they started to support Japan in a way that was almost tantamount to making Japan into a first-rate economic power, if not one day, as we're perhaps going to see today, in our day, a military power. So it got them involved with that, and more than that, Dean Acheson said to the Senate Armed Services Committee that if the Russians and the Chinese, the communists, if they think they can attack Korea, this thing in Asia must be the preparation to some similar move they're preparing to make in Europe. So therefore, we have to prepare in Europe for general conflict. That is an interesting way of using the Korean War as a lever, as a prompting for the rearmament of Europe in a really serious way. But that was the response, the creation of a new European armed force. And during the Korean War, there was a suggestion that was made that there ought to be some kind of new nuclear participation in NATO, and that the United States took the view that European nations ought to supply a considerable conventional contingent of forces to man the barricades against the communist bloc in Europe. And at Lisbon in 1952, they arrived at the Lisbon Force Goals, suggestion there should be 41 divisions, 41 European divisions, European countries, new members of NATO. Remember, NATO had been put together in the course of the Berlin blockade. So this Lisbon Force Goal notion of this enormous supply and drafting of huge numbers of conventional forces, 41 divisions for Europe, that was voted. But of course the governments went home and immediately came to the conclusion, this is going to cost too much. You know, conventional forces cost a good deal more than nuclear forces. Nuclear forces can always be argued for on the basis that they accomplish more than conventional forces for less money. More bang for the buck is the way it is commonly said, and was said at exactly this time. And the Europeans started to think more bang for the buck. Well, but it have to be an American bang. And what they were saying, in effect, was that the Americans are going to have to defend us with their nuclear weapons. That's what the Soviets are really afraid of. And we're not going to defend Europe. That is to say, the Soviets are not going to be dissuaded by defense measures on the part of the Europeans, but by deterrence in the nuclear field. The defense of Europe was going to be a nuclear one, and the United States would take care of it. The Europeans wouldn't have to spend all that money on conventional forces. And what went with that, if there were to be any augmentation of conventional forces, perhaps the one country that really wanted to recover its military, say, at least to some degree, was Germany. And perhaps that was the ticket. So somehow, the war in Korea ended up as an argument for German rearmament. That's a very interesting phenomenon from these days. But let's take it up in a minute because it bears on how the war ended in Korea, but also bears on how the war ended in Indochina. Because remember, at the same time, the French have been fighting in Indochina. So they're fighting between 1946 and 1954. And the conservatives came back in 1951. Winston Churchill squeaked out a victory over the Labour government, and so he came to power again, denationalized a lot of the nationalizations that the that the Labour Party had carried out, and put the British pretty much on a regime of what might be called the new look in defense strategy. The British tested a nuclear weapon. Remember, they had to go their own way after the McMahon Act. So they tested a nuclear weapon in 1952, and Churchill made the decision that their defense appropriations were going to be built around nuclear weapons and not around conventional forces. So this is an idea that was very pregnant and worked for the British. Here's one of the old-fashioned bombers they were going to use to threaten to attack the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. And in the United States, something similar developed. The U.S. took the view that it ought to go the same way, with the new look, more bang for a buck. Massive retaliation was the argument. It was a review of defense policy after Eisenhower defeated Truman, and it was going to put a minus where Truman had put a plus. So maybe you could make the argument, I like to make the argument this way, that two kinds of crises confronted the United States in the Cold War. Crises like Korea, that is to say, an attack that had to be met with conventional American forces and in which we had to take losses. And a crisis like Berlin, such as we saw at the time of the Berlin blockade, a crisis that could be opposed by various other measures, high tension, nuclear threats associated with it, necessarily, but at any rate, eventually that promised victory, and without any real expenditure of life or treasure. Do you want in the future, I think the Republicans were saying to themselves, do we want in the future Berlins or Koreas? And I think the decision was we want Berlins. Massive retaliation, reliance on nuclear weapons, more bang for the buck. What does massive retaliation mean, as John Foster Dulles tells it? Here he is talking with his boss, President Eisenhower. John Foster Dulles said, massive retaliation means that we reserve the right to use massive force, disproportionate force, maybe nuclear force, maybe preemptive nuclear war, in any case where we get opposed by the communists, maybe even over something like Korea. So best not to specify exactly what we'll do in every case, best to leave it to the other side. Uncertainty is the best deterrent. If they don't know what we're liable to do, they are doubly deterred. So that's the essence behind the idea of massive retaliation. That became the U.S. national defense doctrine, cooked up between Eisenhower and Dulles. And between them, they decided that they could do a lot more foreign policy on the cheap. For example, use the intelligence agencies to overthrow governments where they thought communists might get hold, or whether there was an interest, which could be covered by the supposition that whoever it was they were opposed to was somehow yielding to the communists. They always use communism or anti-communism as a kind of cover. And this they did, as you probably already know, in intelligence operations in Iran, after the Iranians under Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized a lot of oil, that the British and the Americans together cooked up this plot, and then it almost didn't work, but it did work in the end. They overthrew the Mossadegh government, a democratically elected government, reinstalled the Shah. Did the same thing in Guatemala, democratically elected government of the left that got on the wrong side of United Fruit, nationalized some land of United Fruit, and same way, intelligence operation, that government was overthrown. So these kind of operations are going to be part of the foreign policy. Massive retaliation, more bang for the buck, intelligence ops instead of military confrontations with the communists. And for that, you had to be willing to go to the brink, Dulles said, to go to the brink. And the papers, especially the liberal papers, eventually started to call this brinkmanship. So that's what Dulles was saying, that we can always be on the edge of war, and we always come out ahead with these things. We can't lose. It's a very risky policy sold to the United States that the United States couldn't live with it eventually, and eventually the Soviets built weapons against it. When they got an intercontinental ballistic missile and got the capability of hitting the United States with rockets after 1957, the United States was going to drop it. Massive retaliation. So we'll talk about that debate when we get there. I guess the last thing we should talk about today is the death of Stalin. The physical laws prevailed. Stalin passed from the scene in 1953. I'm sure on his passing he was contenting himself with the thought that he had led the country through all of its great tests, and that he had advanced communism, and that he had got rid of everybody, of course, who got in his way, but nevertheless had advanced the cause of communism in the world essentially by war and revolution by means of war. Essentially a great figure as proclaimed in this Soviet era poster, which says, under the leadership of the great Stalin, forward to communism. Forward by means of war, I guess you have to say, war or warlike processes, war communism, I sometimes called it in my course on the Russian Revolution. And when Stalin passed from the scene, immediately a new generation came to the fore. You can imagine the enormity of the change in the Soviet Union on the subtraction of this despotic leader who had shot so many people, so many prominent people in the 30s, and had continued at the end of the 40s, who carried out a regime of quite unrelenting terror. Once he passed from the scene, you can imagine how enormous the burden was, that especially with the hostile situation that they faced vis-a-vis the United States in the Cold War, something they undoubtedly had not anticipated during World War II. But at any rate, there they are. So these are the successors of Stalin marching behind them. This picture is kind of nicely symbolic in various ways. On the right side of the picture, you see the successor to Stalin in a white military outfit, Georgy Mayankov, and next to him, Lavrenti Beria, the head of the secret police. So he's arm in arm with Beria, the top cop, murderer, and difficult person, awful person in just about every way of imagining it. I don't want to go into a lot of details about all of his most awful exploits, but he's responsible for the police terror, the second to Stalin on this. So you have to consider his importance, and he's in uniform along with Mayankov, and then next to them, the trusted leader Vyacheslav Molotov, trusted confrere of Stalin, going back to 1922 or so. So the one with the most experience, Molotov, at the far right in this picture, the one with the most experience in foreign policy, probably the smartest one of all of them in just about every respect, very, very radical and left in his perspectives, very pro-Mao, very pro-Chinese. And Mayankov too, Mao liked Mayankov. The turn that brought Mayankov to power was a turn to war and revolution in China in 1947. So Mao was favorably disposed, at least at first, to Mayankov. So there they are, Mayankov, Beria, and then presumably also Molotov. And then on the other end of the picture, two fellows who are just bureaucrats, ordinary civilians. They really look like it in this picture. One whose métier is trade, Anastas Mikoyan at the end of the picture, the far left of the picture, and then Nikita Khrushchev, whose field is agriculture. Okay, so Khrushchev, it turned out, was going to be the one who succeeded Stalin, not Mayankov. And the reason for that was that all of them greatly feared a continuation of Stalin's terror, and that Beria was the personification of this. And even though Beria did his best to reassure them that he wouldn't carry on a Stalin terror. They weren't going to put up with a person who had actually run a Stalinist terror, the Stalinist terror, since 1938. They were not going to put up with this person as their leader. They'd never feel safe until they got rid of him. Now, he may have been a swell fellow and a sincere liberal after 1953, after Stalin's death. That could be. But they weren't going to trust to that idea. They would never feel secure till they got rid of him. So the whole combination on the right side of the picture falls apart if you subtract Beria. And that was Khrushchev's aim, to subtract Beria from Mayankov and go after Mayankov. So the first thing they did was to combine against Beria out of fear, and they got rid of Beria. And within a couple of months, right after the death of Stalin, and then Khrushchev went to work on Mayankov, and it was a problem of the army. Mayankov made a statement to the effect that he thought nuclear weapons would be the end of the world, and a nuclear war ought to be avoided. You would think that would be unimpeachable, but Khrushchev said, no. In a nuclear war, the West will collapse. The capitalists will go under. We will survive it one way or another. We went through World War II, didn't we? We'll survive a nuclear war. Khrushchev never stuck to this after this debate, but in 1954 it worked beautifully. The armed forces sided with Khrushchev against Mayankov, and that is a capsule. I have violated a lot here by putting it this way, but I think that's a capsule description in just a few sentences of the whole question of the succession struggle after the death of Stalin and the rise of Khrushchev to power. And this whole thing was pretty much done by 1955, when Khrushchev started to appear as the major leader. And when he did appear, we had a lot of questions that had to be cleaned up. And perhaps we won't clean them up today. The main thing is going to be what's going to happen with Indochina if the communists win there. And they're going to win. They're going to win. And what does that mean for the world revolution? And how are the Soviets going to lead the world revolution? I mean, in Stalin's era, the Soviets are the leaders of the world revolution. Can they maintain this lead? How is Khrushchev going to get along with Mao Zedong? Looking for a picture of Khrushchev and Mao Zedong. There they are. Relations between those two now will become the the centerpiece in our discussion of the leadership of world communism. And remember, they imagined themselves both to be leading a revolutionary movement by means of war and by means of every other device at their disposal. How will they get along from this point on? Who will lead, and who will follow? So I think these are questions we can take up on another time. We've already used quite a bit of time today, so I think we can take these up next time. And next time I'll talk about the French defeat in Indochina. Dulles and Eisenhower opting for containment and their structure of containment, and the voice of the third world weighing in on the Cold War, weighing in against the Cold War. So an interesting proposition. It's going to be taking hold in the United States. They're going to win over a lot of the American youth to the idea of opposing the Cold War altogether. And that's first stated by the third world at the Bandung Conference in 1955. So a lot of things happened in 1955 that involved big turns in our story. And I think we can take them up next time, and it'll take us all the way up to the Suez Crisis. But that for our next lecture discussion, and we'll be taking that up. We'll be taking that up shortly.